Does the Bible teach a 1,000-year reign? Stay tuned and we'll see exactly what the Bible says.
Churches of Christ present The Truth in Love.
How precious is the book divine, by inspiration given. Bright as a lamp is grace that shine to guide my soul to heaven. Holy Bible, book divine, precious treasure thou art mine. Lamp to my feet and the light to my way, to guide me safely home. It sweetly cheers my drooping heart in this dark vale of tears. Light to my life it still imparts and quells my rising fears. Holy Bible, book divine, precious treasure thou art mine. Lamp to my feet and the light to my way, to guide me safely home.
I'm Lawson Mayo, your host on The Truth in Love. Our speaker today is Stafford North, the Executive Vice President of Oklahoma Christian College in Oklahoma City. This is a lesson on the 1,000-year reign. It's a repeat of a lesson 4 in a series that Dr. North has done before. We invite you to our study.
One of the most frequently talked about subjects as people discuss the book of Revelation is the 1,000-year reign. You'll hear a lot about it. Sometimes it's called the millennium because the word millennium means 1,000 years. And indeed, in the 20th chapter of the book of Revelation, there is mentioned a 1,000-year reign. There's no question but what there will be some kind of 1,000-year reign. The question, of course, is, what does it mean? To what does it have reference when it speaks of a 1,000-year reign? Since this has been one of the most frequently discussed and sometimes puzzling subjects that people encounter as they study the book of Revelation and maybe the Bible itself, we'd like to spend our lesson today discussing the 1,000-year reign and what it is, what it means, and what we should get from the idea of the 1,000-year reign. In order to do that, we need to set the stage just a little bit from some earlier things that take place in the book of Revelation. We had a previous lesson on this, but we'll just review it for a moment to catch up a bit on some of the symbols that are used in the book of Revelation and to talk about the particular point in the story where the 20th chapter occurs. On our board, we still have some of the symbols that were mentioned earlier that are described in the book of Revelation. There was introduced in chapter 12 a great red dragon. This dragon has 7 heads, and he sweeps a third of the stars out of the sky with his tail. Chapter 12 and verse 9 and also chapter 20 and verse 2 tell us clearly who the dragon is. The dragon is Satan, the devil. There's no doubt about that. We're very plainly told who the dragon is. And he is behind the scenes working to try to thwart God's plan. God is establishing by his plan the salvation of man through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Satan did not want that to happen. And so behind the scenes we find the dragon impersonating Satan or representing Satan, and there he is working to try to keep God's plan from coming to pass. Now, in order to help him do that, he brings up some assistants, and these are mentioned in the 13th chapter of the book of Revelation. And here we have the first beast, and he also has 7 heads, and then we have a second beast which has 2 horns like a lamb. Now, in these 2, as we discussed in the earlier lesson, we have symbolized the Roman Empire by the first beast. This Roman Empire is one that Satan has used to try to persecute the church. He has used this beast to force people to try to worship the emperor. And so the emperor, one of the heads of the beast, has declared himself God. And he's going to make people to worship him. And as Christians were confronted with that problem, they of course had to refuse to worship the emperor because they could not regard the emperor as a deity, as a god. And so when they refused, they were subjected to terrible punishment. And the book of Revelation is written to comfort these persecuted Christians of the first century. The second beast, as we read in chapter 13 of Revelation, represents those who went about trying to require and force emperor worship, setting up images of the head of the beast, the emperor, and trying to require people by pain of death or of economic problems, refusing to let them buy and sell and trade and come to the marketplaces. This second beast would force people into worshiping the emperor. And those who refused would be subjected to terrible trouble. Well, we read in chapters 14 through 19 about the work of these two beasts, and then about how God is going to see that they come to a just end. And so by the time we come to the end of chapter 19, we read that these two beasts, or the beast and the false prophet as they're sometimes called, have been thrown into the lake that burns with fire and brimstone. God has taken care of them. He has brought the Roman Empire to an end. And he even describes in chapter 16, under the symbol of the pouring out of the bowls, some of the ways he's going to do that, by using the force of nature, by using internal dissension and destruction and immorality to weaken the Roman Empire, and by the attacks from beyond the Euphrates and other borders of the empire. And by these means God would bring that empire to an end. And so we've studied that in earlier lessons and review it here simply to show that by the end of chapter 19 we have the main storyline of the book of Revelation completed. The Roman Empire, the great persecutor, has been disposed of. The question that the saints under the altar asked in chapter 9, or chapter 6, verse 9 and 10, has been answered. There they asked, "How long, O Master, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood upon them that are on the earth?" And the book of Revelation is written to answer that question. By the time we come to chapter 19 and the first two verses, these martyrs who have given their lives for the cause of Christ, who are in heaven, cry out, saying, "Now you have taken your power and have avenged our blood, and we're glad that you have answered our question and helped us to understand all that was going on." Now as we come to the end of chapter 19, we have seen these two beasts disposed of, and we enter chapter 20. And of course the question is, what happens after the fall of the Roman Empire? What happens to Satan, the dragon, who is still left? And that's basically what we're going to talk about in chapter 20. And you'll see as we pick up the story in chapter 20 that God is now moving to fill us in a little bit as to what will happen after the Roman Empire falls, after the beast is gone, and to carry us from there in a very quick, cursory fashion over to the end of the world. And so chapter 20 describes how God will deal with the dragon. Now, we're ready to look at chapter 20, and I hope you have your Bibles open to that so that we can recognize the things that God has for us in this chapter. The principal focus of our lesson on chapter 20 will be in the first 6 verses, because that's where we read about the 1,000-year reign. And as we read about it, there are 2 essential elements of the 1,000-year reign. The first one is discussed in the first 3 verses, and the second was discussed in verses 4 through 6. The first section discusses the binding of Satan, verses 1 to 3. So we're dealing first with the binding of Satan. And it's symbolized like this. There's an angel that comes, and this angel has a key to the abyss, and he has a great chain in his hand, and he opens the abyss, and he binds Satan, the dragon, with a chain, and casts him into this abyss, or bottomless pit, and locks the key over him, or locks the lid over him with a key, and he does that so that he can deceive the nations no more. Now here we know that Satan is being represented with the dragon, and we know, of course, that we're finding here a binding of Satan. But let's pause for a moment and recognize that Satan, in one way or another, has always been bound. That is, God has always placed a limit upon Satan. Way back in the book of Job, Satan came before God. God said, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And Satan said, well, of course he's good. You won't ever let me touch him. Just let me do some things and he will abandon his faith to you. So God allowed Satan to go a little ways. He said, you can do this, but you can't do any more. Job was still faithful. Satan came and said, just let me do a little more, and I think he'll renounce you. And so all during this we see Satan is limited. He is bound. During the time that Christ was on earth, he said, you accuse me of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub. That is, you're saying I cast out demons by the power of the demons, the power of the devil. Why, he says that's impossible, because you can't go into the house of the strong man unless he is first bound. And so Christ could not have cast out demons unless there had been some kind of limitation or binding upon Satan. When the 70 returned after having gone out and they had been able to work miracles and cast out demons, they were very pleased about what had happened. And Jesus talks to them and says, I saw Satan falling from heaven. He recognizes that this is a time in which Satan is being limited and his power is being restricted. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 15 talks about how when Christ was crucified, there were certain limits put on the power of Satan. All during the Scriptures, then, we read about various kinds of limitations on Satan. And these refer not all to the same limitation, but limitations of different kinds. God always keeps the upper hand in dealing with Satan. And so when we come to this binding, we ask, what kind of binding is it? From what is Satan bound? In what way is he bound? Well, we're told he is bound so that he can deceive the nations no more. That is, earlier in the book of Revelation, Satan had been able to use a coalition of nations under the Roman Empire, a group of nations under the Roman head, to try to stamp out the early church. The church was just beginning, just getting started, during its period of infancy and establishment, and Satan knew in his own mind, if I can stop it from ever getting established, then I won't ever have to worry about it throughout time. And so he put forth a maximum effort to thwart God's plan of establishing the church by persecuting early Christians. And to do that, he took the power of the Roman Empire and turned it against the church and used it as a force against the church. God says, I let Satan do that once. And now that he's done that and he's failed to stop the church, I've brought the Roman Empire to a conclusion, and now I will not ever let Satan use a great world empire to stamp out the church again. It doesn't mean that Satan can't tempt us anymore. Of course he can. It doesn't mean that there will not be persecutions anymore. Of course there will be. But there will never again be the opportunity for Satan to take a great world power, a great empire that encompassed the known world, and to use that empire to try to stamp out the church. And so Satan through the 1,000 years will be bound or limited in the sense that he can use the nations no more. He can't deceive them in the way he did with the beast that he brought up, the Roman Empire. That's the way in which Satan will be limited during the 1,000 years. Now we move to the second section, verses 4 through 6. And we see the other side of the 1,000 years. Same 1,000 years, but now we're moving from the binding of Satan to what else is happening. And now we read, and I saw thrones, and they sat upon them. And he said, I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the cause of Christ and who held his testimony. I saw these souls living and reigning with Christ for 1,000 years. Here we have a reign for 1,000 years being described. Now, in order to understand what this reign is and what it is talking about and why it is mentioned here, we need to ask some very key questions, some simple questions, but very important ones. First of all, we ask, who reigns for the 1,000 years? Who is going to reign? Well, we're clearly told who is reigning. It's the souls of those who have been beheaded, those who don't worship the beast or his image, those who've gone through the terrible martyrdom. Now, we've met these people before in the book of Revelation. In fact, they're the heroes of the whole book. We were first introduced to them in chapter 6 and verse 9. The souls under the altar crying out, "How long, O Master, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood upon them that are upon the earth?" We see them again in chapter 7. They've been given white robes in chapter 6. Now in chapter 7, the last part, they're wearing those white robes and they're serving before the throne of God and in His temple. And they don't hunger and thirst anymore. God is taking care of them. Then in chapter 14, we see them again. And here they are following the Lamb wherever He goes. And they're rejoicing because this terrible persecution is now over. In chapter 15, we find them again here in the heavenly picture around the sea, singing songs. In chapter 19, we see them again. And here in chapter 19, they're crying the victory because God has taken His power and has destroyed the one who was destroying the church or attempting to destroy the church. And then they ride with their white robes following Christ as He rides on His white horse and casts the two beasts into the lake of fire. They're following Him. And now in chapter 20 we see them again. There's one commentary on Revelation that says these souls are unidentified. Why, they're not unidentified at all. They've been the heroes of the book all the way through. They're the ones who are in the mind of God throughout the writing of this book. It's for them and for their benefit, those first century Christians that are about to be martyred and who during the course of the story of Revelation are martyred. It's for their benefit the book was being written. And now He is telling them, I'm telling you what it's going to be like after you've suffered the martyrdom and after you have gone through this terrible time that's put upon you by the Roman Empire that Satan is using. And then you survive that, not in your bodies, because your bodies will be killed, but you'll survive it as souls. The real you will still be living. And that real you, that soul, after all this is over and after I've disposed of the Roman Empire, you can live and reign with me in that status of souls for 1,000 years. Who reigns then? It is these souls of the martyrs, beheaded for the testimony of Jesus, who would not submit to the Roman Empire and its persecution. And notice that they're in the status of souls. We know they've died, their bodies are dead, they've been beheaded. You just don't see people beheaded without dying, so they're dead. And they haven't been resurrected yet in the sense that their bodies have been resurrected, because that comes over in the latter part of chapter 20 when the sea gives up the dead that are in it and death and Hades give up the dead that are in them. And so the general resurrection doesn't come until we get to the end of chapter 20. So these are in the status of souls between their death and the eventual resurrection of their bodies. And so souls in that intermediate state live and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. That's who reigns. Now the next question is, why do they reign? Why do these souls reign? Well, of course, it's a great victory reign, isn't it? They're wanting to know, how are we going to fare after all this is over? If we submit to persecution, what will happen to us? Is the church going to survive? Will the Roman Empire be successful? Will Satan be successful in stamping it out? The answer clearly is no. Satan and the Roman Empire will not succeed. And when I've shown them to be a failure and bound Satan so he can no longer deceive the nations in the way he's done before, then I'm going to let you join me in a great victory celebration. And you'll live and reign with me for 1,000 years. What would have been a greater challenge to these first century Christians who received the book of Revelation and were about to have to undergo persecution than to know, if I survive this persecution with my faith intact, even though I may die, if I'm faithful to the Lord, what He has in mind for me afterwards is to live and reign with Him for 1,000 years. Now, we come to the next question. Where do they reign? We've seen who reigns, that is, the souls of the martyrs. Why do they reign? It's a great victory celebration. And then where do they reign? Well, of course, we ask the question, where have these souls been throughout our study of the book of Revelation? In chapter 6, they were in heaven under the altar. Chapter 7, they were in heaven around the throne. Chapter 14, they were in heaven following the Lamb. Chapter 15, they're in heaven around the sea of glass, the crystal sea. And there they're singing. Chapter 19, they're in heaven singing before God and praising Him. Chapter 19, they're following the Lamb, or rather the Christ, who is now pictured as riding on the white horse. And so they've been in heaven throughout the story. Now as we come to the 20th chapter, we're introduced to these same people. Why would we think that they would be anywhere else? They're in heaven. That's where the reign takes place. Where else would souls reign? If they're in this intermediate state, they're certainly not going to be on earth, because it wouldn't mean anything to reign on earth if you are not in your physical body, and these are not. They're souls, and are in that status all the way through the book of Revelation. They sit on thrones. We've seen thrones throughout the book of Revelation. In chapter 4 we see thrones. Chapter 5 we see thrones. In other chapters we see the thrones as God and others are depicted as sitting on thrones, and they're always in heaven. Now we see thrones depicted. Why would they be anywhere else? Christ, where has He been throughout the story? Well, in chapter 5 He appears as a lamb before the throne of God. And then in chapter 14 He's still a lamb. In chapter 12 He was a child taken up to heaven and there to be with God and to reign over nations. In chapter 19 He's in His victory march over these defeated beasts. Christ has always been pictured as in heaven. So now Christ is living and reigning. Why would He be anywhere else but in heaven? So as you read verses 4 through 6 and the history of the 1,000-year reign, and this is the only place in the Bible the 1,000-year reign is mentioned at all. As you read this, can you find any mention of earth at all? Never is mentioned. But the souls are mentioned, and they're always in heaven. Thrones are mentioned, they're always in heaven. Christ is mentioned, always in heaven. Why would we think of the reign being anywhere else except in heaven? Now we come to the fourth basic question. We've seen who reigns, the souls of martyrs. Why they reign, because it's a victory celebration. We've seen where they reign, that's in heaven. And the final question is, when do they reign? When does this 1,000-year reign take place? Well, we ended chapter 19 by suggesting that that symbolizes the fall of the persecutor, the fall of the Roman Empire. It falls in chapter 19. The beast and the false prophet that had enforced emperor worship have been cast into the lake that burns with fire and brimstone. They're gone. Chapter 20, of course, follows immediately, and the 1,000 years starts immediately, and so the 1,000 years is going to begin after the fall of Rome. And it lasts until almost the end of time. The only thing that separates it from the end of time is what is called a little time, mentioned in verse 7. Satan is released from his prison for a little time and goes out and starts to try to deceive the nations again, and before he gets anywhere, it seems, he is taken, and fire comes from heaven, and he is thrown into the lake of fire where the two beasts have gone. So all that separates the 1,000 years from the very end of time is just this little season that Satan seems to be allowed to sort of attempt to break out again, and before he gets anywhere, he's cast into the lake of fire where others have gone before him. So this 1,000 years then fills the period in the story from the fall of Rome until the end of time. And it signifies to these martyrs, look, after Rome falls, you're going to be seen as victors. You're going to get to reign with me in a victory celebration that will last all throughout time until the end of the world comes. And the 1,000 years, of course, is not a literal period of time of 1,000 years, like the two beasts, and like the dragon, and like the lamb, and like people riding on horses. These numbers are but symbols. We have periods of 3.5 years, we have periods of 3.5 days, we have periods of 10 days, we have all kinds of symbolic periods of time in the book of Revelation. And so the 1,000 years is a symbolic period, not a literal 1,000 years, but a symbolic period of time representing a relatively long period. And you know, we use the number 1,000 symbolically. We say, I've told you 1,000 times not to tell me that. And by saying 1,000 times, we mean many, many times, a great number of times, a full number of times. And so the idea here is simply Christ is saying, I'm going to let you live and reign with me to the fullness of 1,000 years. That is, from the time of the demise of the beasts, you're going to be with me in this great victory celebration until the end of time comes. And so, when they reign is after the fall of the beast and before and until Christ comes again. Now let's look at one other passage that makes it very clear that this reign is before the return of Christ and not after. If you'll turn to 1 Corinthians, the 15th chapter, beginning in verse 22, we find some very interesting things. In this chapter about the resurrection, we learn this. Jesus is said to be the first one to be raised. Christ is the first fruits. Then they that are Christ's are raised at his coming. The resurrection will be when Christ returns. They that are Christ's at his coming. Then comes the end. When Christ returns, he raises the dead, then comes the end. Now those who believe that the 1,000-year reign follows Christ's return have to make the passage read like this. Christ returns, the dead are raised, and then comes a 1,000-year reign. No, no. Then comes the end. And this passage goes on to tell us what will happen in the kingdom. Then comes the end, when Christ shall deliver up the kingdom to God. When Christ returns and raises the dead, he ends his kingdom. He doesn't start a new one. He doesn't begin to reign when he returns. He ends his reign. His reign is over when he has conquered death. It's the last enemy, this passage says. And when he conquers that last enemy of death by the resurrection, then his reign is over. And so Christ's return does not bring a beginning of a 1,000-year reign. It brings an end to his reign. Therefore, we know this 1,000-year reign is not after his coming, but before.
There are two more studies in this series by Dr. North, one on Armageddon, and the other, Does the Bible Teach a Rapture? For your free booklet on these three studies, just send your name and address and ask for the booklet on the last days. We'd be very happy to send that to you at absolutely no charge to you. Congregation that assists us in bringing these materials to you and the program week by week is the Church of Christ that meets at 2401 Bedford Road in Bedford, Texas. These brethren meet at 10:30 on Sunday morning, and you'd find a most cordial welcome with them as you would worship there today. Until we meet next time, may you walk with the Lord.
This has been The Truth in Love, sponsored by Churches of Christ. For a copy of today's program, additional information, or Bible correspondence course at no charge to you, please write The Truth in Love, Post Office Box 865, Hurst, Texas 76053. Once again, write The Truth in Love, Post Office Box 865, Hurst, Texas 76053. We invite you to attend the Church of Christ in your area. Join us again next Sunday at this same time for The Truth in Love.